Welcome everyone to the Agrarian Change Seminar series for Spring 2024. I'm Shreya Sinha. I'm one of the editors of the Journal of Agrarian Change, and I'm a lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. So, as many of you would know, the Journal of Agrarian Change has been organizing an annual seminar series continuously since 2008, and we've been running this in kind of a hybrid or online mode since the start of COVID-19. So today's seminar is co-organized with the Center on Labour, Sustainability and Global Production, CLASP, at Queen Mary University of London. I'm also very pleased to be joined here by some co-organizers. So we have Amod Shah, who's based at ISS The Hague, and also Enrique Castañón, who's from UCL, and another co-organizer, Carlos from SOAS, will join shortly. So I mean, before we move, to the seminar today, I want to flag that this seminar is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded on the Journal of Agrarian Change's YouTube channel, which as per usual. But in case you don't want to be recorded, just refrain from unmuting yourself and speaking. You can also always put your questions in the chat or and so on. So today's seminar then, today we have Professor Sarah Ruth Sippel. She's Professor of Economic Geography and Globalization Studies at Münster University. In her previous research, she has worked on interlinkages between export agriculture, rural livelihood security, and labor migration in North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. Her current research investigates how land is turned into a financial asset, an object for financial investment and speculation. And I suppose that's what we'll be hearing about today. And more recently, she has also started developing new projects on the research and development and financing of digital farming technologies and diverse economies in rural southern Italy. So welcome, Sarah. So the floor is yours, really. You have 45 to 50 minutes for your presentation, and then we move to questions and answers. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Shreya, for this kind invitation and the introduction. I'm actually currently on maternity leave, as we just discussed before. So over the past few months, I've mostly been talking to my now almost 4-month-old baby. So this is a very nice change now to actually be back in academia again, and I'm very delighted to be part of this series. All right, okay, so I would start by sharing my screen, and please let me know if this looks like it should. Is it the full screen? Okay, yeah, perfect. All right, yes, so Shreya already introduced what I've been working on, what my main research focus has been over the past years, and this is also what I'll be talking about today. And I would like to start with a quote from one of my interviews, where one of my interlocutors told me that you've got to understand the asset class, understand what you're doing, and have a mindset. You have to sit back and wait, but be ready for when the opportunities present. Land is a different asset class to play in. So what we can see from this quote here, over the past few decades, all things nature have been subjected to finance's reimagining, be it water, oil, wildlife, or weather. Nature is increasingly providing the basis for a whole range of new financial asset classes and products, and this also applies to farmland. However, it seems also farmland is somehow different. As my interlocutor says here, land is a different asset class to play in. And what does it really mean? This is one of the main things I would like to address today. So intensified by the global food price and financial crises, and as a response to the poor performance of so-called traditional asset classes, financial institutions have come to reconsider farmland as an important storage of value and profitable investment. This has often been underpinned by assumptions surrounding farmland's performance over the past few decades. For example, pointing out that farmland as an asset class offers or is assumedly offering a lot lower volatility than other asset classes. So the goal within all of this has been to turn farmland into a financial asset. That is to say, a liquid asset that can be flexibly bought and sold, while also systematically and reliably producing future income streams for investors. Rendering land investable, however, is not always a smooth process. Land, as my interlocutor says, it's a special asset class to play in, it seems. And what I would like to argue here today is that the tangibilities and materialities, but also the social and moral embeddings of land present a challenge for its assetization. So as I will argue then, this requires active reimaginations of what land is, what it does, and what can be done with it. So based on qualitative research on the intersection between finance and farmland, mostly in Australia, in my presentation today, I would like to explore the various reimaginations of land that underlie and go along with the assetization of land. And I will do this by specifically focusing on what I call the imaginative work that is performed by the farmland investment brokers that are crucially involved in rendering land investable. These intermediaries, as I will demonstrate, are key actors within the assetization of farmland, and their reimaginations of what land is and what it can do have played a very important role in envisioning, promoting, and establishing farmland as a financial asset class. So a brief outline of what I will be doing today now in my presentation, or what to expect. I would like to start just briefly with a bit of a conceptual framework, specifically on this, the notion of assetization work and what I mean by that. This is then followed by a brief embedding of the Australian context within the global land rush and some background on the empirical research that I've conducted there. And then I come to 5 key dimensions in which farmland investment brokers have been contributing to land's reimagination as a financial asset, ranging from land's visual representation to notions of control and numeric representations of land, to social norms surrounding land and farming, and the construction of value. And then I'd like to conclude by briefly discussing the implications of land's assetized future. Okay, so to start with the conceptual background. In my work more generally, I combine insights from the social studies of finance, the recent scholarship on financialization and assetization, and the notion of land imaginaries. And to start with the concept of financialization here, of course, financialization, I think most of you have probably come across this term or this concept by now. It's become very important focus within processes of social and economic transformation of the past 2 decades, I'd say. Here, or specifically for my work, I would like to conceptualize financialization in a bit of a dynamic way. So I consider it as a specific process of transforming the world by recurring to and advancing the practices, theories, and instruments that originate in the financial sector, mostly drawing on Chiapello and her chapter that she published in 2020. Focusing then on this multiplicity of practices, theories, and instruments allows me then to recognize the collective effort undertaken by a broad variety of actors that are involved in advancing financialization, and therefore also to specifically focus on the actors and their practices within the context of financialization, within advancing financialization. Financialization then can be seen as an ongoing process, a form of work, we could say, in itself, that can have varying degrees and that also remains incomplete or contested. To add to this then, to explore how land is rendered investable, I believe it is furthermore helpful to also distinguish between the broader process of financialization and the notion of assetization. I'm sorry, there are a lot of isations here. I'm happy to discuss these later on in the discussion. But I believe these are quite useful here to conceptually frame this topic. So the notion of assetization, I would introduce it here as a concept that is pointing out as a more specific component of financialization. So here drawing on Keen Birch and his work on assets and assetization. Assets can be considered as, or assetization can be considered as a transformation of things into revenue generating and tradable resources. Following Birch, then, what makes assets distinct is that they are a recurring source of revenue. So rather than just treating something as, for example, a commodity, where the exchangeability constitutes the key characteristic of a certain thing at a specific moment in time. With the asset here, the emphasis is on the possibility to deliver a consistent and reliable income stream. What is more, assets do not exist, of course, as such, but things or services, or in this case, land, need to be actively turned into an asset as part of, again, a specific process or practice that we could consider or call asset making. Assetization then also relies on active and continuous work, and assets are similarly to financialization then, of course, or to financial assets are always in the making, we could say. This assetization work then is done by a host of different actors who, as intermediaries or mediators, as serviles, help transform objects and social relations into financial assets and thus move them through the global economy. And then to add on to this, the third component here, third conceptual component, is that I would like to suggest that assetization also includes an important imaginative component, which both precedes and accompanies these transformative practices. So here I suggest that the assetization of farmland involves also a comprehensive reimagination of what land is and what it can do, which inspires and intersects with actual practices in multiple ways. This concerns specifically the reimagination of land's possible future, as land, to here quote Searle again, land must be transformed in advance into a plausible future asset stream using tools such as valuations, forecasts, investment prospectuses, contracts, and financial instruments. To further underpin this imaginative component within assetization practices, I draw here on the notion of land imaginaries, as I developed it together with my colleague Arne Visser in a special issue that was published in 2021, and where we consider land imaginaries as encompassing the various societal understandings of what land is, its different uses and values, and ideas of what it can or should do in society. So to sum up here in what follows, I would like to specifically focus on the imaginative work performed by farmland investment brokers within their efforts of turning land into a financial asset. However, before coming to these reimaginations, the 5 reimaginations I announced in the beginning, just a little bit of background on the research side that I mostly worked in, namely Australia. So Australia, as located in the global north, it holds a particular place within the global land rush. It has mostly been targeted by investors for its assumed stable system of politics and governance, the strong interest of the government in securing investments from abroad, its well-developed infrastructure, proximity to Asian markets, and finally also counter-seasonal production, which advantages farm exports to the Northern Hemisphere. The recent increase in agricultural investment in Australia has mostly been driven by overseas buyers with financial actors having purchased farms across different farming regions, from New South Wales to Tasmania to the Northern Territory. So almost every region in Australia has received some sort of financial investment in farmland. And these investments have been undertaken also in a variety of productions, such as broadacre cropping, tree plantations, cattle breeding, or dairy. In terms of quantification, the total amount of farmland that is currently owned by financial investors in Australia is difficult or maybe impossible to calculate, as there is no comprehensive public information available on this form of investment, and also investments are often changing, or land ownership often can change very quickly. So it's quite difficult to actually keep track of it. Nevertheless, it is safe to say, though, that financial actors have become quite important players in Australian agriculture within a relatively short amount of time. Among the major actors are pension funds, such as the US-based TIAA-CREF here, which is one of the largest institutional landowners worldwide. Westchester, which is managing farmlands on behalf of TIAA-CREF, has also started acquiring land in Australia around 2007 and continuously increased their holdings, currently amounting to some 380,000 hectares. Another key player is the Macquarie Bank, which is based in Sydney, or Macquarie Group, a global investment bank and financial services provider. Macquarie currently runs 2 agricultural funds, a pastoral fund and a crop fund, and these together manage some 4.7 million hectares of farmland, mostly located in Australia. In addition to these really quite big players, there's a variety of farmland investment companies offering their services to investors. These farmland investment companies have also been raising capital globally. They can have several hundreds of thousands of dollars under management and are often specialized on specific crops, areas, production styles, and investment models. So to come, oops. Sorry, I'm just trying to move my presentation forward. Oh, here we go. Okay. To come to my empirical research also just briefly. So what did I actually do? Empirically, I spent over 12 months in Australia to conduct field work, mostly between 2016 and 2019, where I combined participant observation at industry events and the community and farm levels with more than 70 interviews with various actors in this agri-finance space. Today, I'm specifically drawing on a subset of 25 interviews with farmland investment brokers who worked for these farmland investment companies in either a leading position or had set up these companies themselves. So why this focus, though, on the farmland investment brokers? As mediators of global capital, farmland investment brokers fulfill a central role within the assetization of farmland. Intermediating between the spheres of global finance and local farms, they, as Alexander Spadotto et al. Write very importantly here, they are the ones who prospect, negotiate, clear, legalize, develop, and sell the land. They are the real connection between the global economy, which dominant global financial players sustain through their projects, and the local level, where they impose their projects. All right, so to turn now to this major question: how is land being reimagined by these investment brokers? In the following, I would like to sketch out these 5 dimensions. But before that, of course, let me say that all these reimaginations, of course, do not take place in a separate, unilateral, or homogeneous fashion, but rather they can also intersect in multiple ways, rely on active promotion and framing, rhetoric support and production of evidence, while being subject to negotiation and active contestation. Okay, so to start with the first, how do farmland investment brokers imagine the farmland they are advertising to their prospective investors? Here, investor brochures, websites, and further visual material farmland investment companies create for these clients are an excellent source to uncover these land imaginaries. Looking through this material, a first immediate observation is that the land presented in these images is never inhabited. It is neither inhabited by humans nor non-human animals. What we see is rather empty land. Land, we could say, has been emptied of anything social or alive, be it people, villages, or signs of other living beings. With this land imaginary, the land seems to have only one function: to produce. At the core of the farmland investor imaginary, we find large-scale industrial kinds of productions where crops are being planted orderly in rows of mostly monocultural productions of the world's major global crops. So what I would suggest here is that there are three core messages about land that are being conveyed by these farmland investor imaginaries. Firstly, we can see that land has an orderly structure. We are presented with fields that have clear lines and defined demarcations. This land has been enclosed and is, we can assume, subject to a private property regime. This orderly structure then further suggests that land is well controlled and regulated. There are no wild spots or unruly areas. There are no risks for resistance or protest. In other words, land has been territorialized. That means both measured and controlled. Lastly, then, the investor land imaginary suggests that land is a valuable resource. Land has been commodified, it can be bought and sold, and thus can, and most likely will, also increase in value. Its fruits, so to say, its income streams, are just there at your fingertips. However, of course, depictions of land in investor brochures can only go that far in attracting capital into farmland. Further assetization work needs to be done once a possible investor's interest has been raised, which then brings me here to the second reimagining of land. One of the key challenges my interviewees faced in rendering farmland attractive to financial investors is the volatility and unpredictability of farming and the sense of lacking control that comes with it. As one farmland investment broker told me, everything in agriculture is changeable. Every day things are changing. It's a biological system. The risks involved with agriculture, he said, were almost infinite, starting with the climate to soils and pastures and how the farming activities impacted on those, to risks in terms of productivity and profit. The sense of lacking control and misconceptions of the risks involved with agriculture has scared many financial investors away, as another of my interviewees reported. He told me financial investors love the idea of farming and exposure to agriculture, but when it comes down to it, they just don't understand the risk that they are taking on. The volatility of farming, then as soon as you hit a drought, people freak out and they want to sell. Seeking to raise capital for their farmland investment funds, the brokers thus saw a main challenge in explaining to financial investors what actually farming is and to give them an understanding of how agriculture behaves as an asset class. Remember the quote from the beginning, it is a special asset class to play in. To explain farming to investors and educate them about this new asset class, then one of my informants used the imaginary of the farm as a factory. He told me, so saying for a beef farm, what we do in a breeding farm is we've got cows and that's like a factory. We've got bulls and they come in. They are just an input to the factory. Then we end up with baby cows that we sell. So from a factory point of view, it's pretty easy to understand. So once you start to take them, the investors, through that, they get it. Whether or not this farmland investment broker who told me this indeed believed in this factory-style farming himself, I think is less important here than what this imaginary actually does or helps him to do. While some agricultural systems might be closer to the controlled environment of a factory than others, it is pretty clear that the majority of farming is still far from taking place under factory-like conditions. The notion of the farm as a factory, however, creates a powerful imaginary that starts from a point of familiarity, something that the investor assumingly understands and also appreciates. It moreover conveys, again, a notion of control, suggesting that farming can take place in a controlled environment with limited variables, predictable outcomes, and therefore limited risks, which is, of course, what financial actors are looking for. Then again, however, of course, this imaginary of controlled farming alone also does not yet create an investment-grade asset. It does need to be complemented and sustained with the hard facts of data, which now brings me to the third reimagining of land. The assetization of land also actually being represented in order to become legible for investors and commensurable with the other assets they are holding in their portfolios. In other words, to become an investable asset, the farm needs to be transformed into a standardized and benchmarked asset, endowed with rich data on historical returns and financial track records. This data allows investors to not only value farms, i.e. by ascribing economic value to the farm, but also allows for commensuration as the valuation or measuring of different objects with a common metric. The availability of such farm data, however, is another key challenge, and this not only in those frontier regions of the global south, but also, and maybe somewhat surprisingly, in an industrialized farming context such as Australia. As one informant told me, data and history are important to investors. That's where investors struggle. Let's be honest there. Why do you think there aren't a lot of investors in agriculture? It's because the data is not there. When they go and invest in the stock market, they can see what an index has done for years and years and years. This is agriculture, which is not as sophisticated when it comes to that. So in addition to the volatility, unpredictability, and lacking control of farming that I mentioned above, my interviewees identified this lack of data as a second major barrier in farming. Farmland investment brokers then deal with this dearth of data in two ways. One strategy is to use the imaginative power of models as presenting a coherent and scaled down version of a future reality. Historical data is rarely or often not available at all for individual farms. Investment brokers create models that, based on the combination of available environmental data and assumptions made on input costs and market developments, calculate potential future returns for the farm. A second strategy then is to take the data collection on the farm to another level and, as one of my informants said, establish the sophisticated database that investors want to see. Here it's specifically the use and implementation of digital farming technologies to collect data, which is seen as paramount. Digital technologies here are presented as rendering the farm like any other factory, infrastructure, or property investment by putting a set of quantifiable metrics around the farm. In other words, digital farming technologies are considered as allowing for and fostering the reimagination of farming as an increasingly hybrid biotechnological activity. Complementing the reimagining of the farm, these metrics are again supposed to create a sense of certainty that promises control and predictability for investors. However, this still, I think there are still more imaginations or processes of reimagination that we can find. So the assetization does not only concern the level of farm management technologies and their representation to investors, but it also crucially involves a reimagination of the social norms and values surrounding land and farming, along with associated farming identities and practices, which brings me to the fourth reimagination. So one key element within the assetization of land and farming is the conceptual separation, or one could say disentangling of the various elements that are involved in farming to create separate farm-based income streams. And let me give you a little bit, or let's go a little bit into financial theory background here to explain this point. So the creation of farm-based income streams is closely connected with a number of assumptions regarding the performance of farmland in financial portfolios as grounded in financial theory. So simply put, farmland returns consist of two parts. The income return, defined as the portion of the farm revenue or profits attributed to the land as opposed to labor and management, and the capital return, which is understood as the change in the market value of the land from year to year. With both components delivering theoretically independent income streams. You might have heard of this famous quote, farmland is like gold with yield. So this is what is meant here. It's productive and appreciating. Income streams from farmland can therefore be based on a number of components. So they can combine either the income, production, or rent from a tenant with then the anticipated appreciation of farmland value. The separation of land ownership and land management then is a key component of the so-called own lease out model, which is a very common farmland investment model. Here, the income stream results from the combined anticipated land appreciation and the rent received from leasing out the land, while the management of the land and associated production risks are shifted to a tenant. Processes of assetizing elements and activities to turn them into separate and distinguishable entities that are able to deliver reliable income streams independently of one another. This reimagination of farms and associated farming practices, I argue, requires proactive work of changing farming practices and identities. And one example here is the promotion of a new tenant culture instead of prevailing land ownership, which of course means that the social norms and values around farming in many, many parts of the world have to be reimagined. Farmland investment brokers in Australia have been working hard to do away with the importance of land ownership for being a farmer in Australia. As one informant told me, he often presented the comparison of hairdressers or shopkeepers to farmers. These, he argued, usually did not own the commercial real estate they used for their businesses, nor did they think owning the real estate was an important part of their identity. Renting, then, my informant claimed, was a well-established practice in many such professions. Why, he then challenged the farmers, did they hold on to such old ideas of having to own the land they worked on? So what we can see here is that, farmland investment brokers have been trying to promote a new tenant culture in order to render land investable in this way for their investors. Lastly, then, and this is the fifth dimension I would like to stress here, we can also see that there is a substantial reimagining of land's value. Land value assessments are critical within land's assetization Given that, as I mentioned before, the capital return from land appreciation is a key component within the construction of land-based income streams. Land's value, however, cannot just be measured. Rather, land value results from very specific and potentially diverging practices of ascribing value to land. These valuation practices can be subject to change, especially if the object that is being valued is becoming financialized, as is the case here with land, of course. Historically, land in Australia has been valued according to the direct comparison or summation approaches. Both conceptualize the value of farmland as the economic value derived from the price paid for a similar plot of land on the farmland market. Financial investors, however, are not necessarily interested in assessing farmland's value based on previously paid prices. Rather, they want to look at land's value by using the same standard return on capital investment indicators that apply to other sectors. Hence, with the increasing activity of financial investors in Australian farmland markets in recent years, there has been a strong push to change the farmland valuation methodology from the comparison and summation approach to the so-called income-based approach, which is a much more common valuation method in the realm of financial investment. In its most basic sense, then the income approach is based on the broadly interpreted principle of anticipation. A property's value is at today's value of income it is anticipated to generate in the future. So what does this mean then? Amongst others, and importantly, I would argue the temporality of land's value changes. So rather than grounded in past market prices, within the income approach, value then lies in the asset's capacity to generate of calculating the present worth of this future income. Altering the valuation methodology for farmland in this way then poses a number of challenges. For instance, whether the land's value is seen in relation to the income it produced historically or in an anticipated future scenario, or whether the materiality of land itself is seen as having value independent of these factors. For example, it could be argued that land's value is different from other assets, even if its average return over a certain period of time was a loss. For example, due to climatic circumstances, there is still productive land, or valuable land, one could argue, there when it rains. So despite these and other issues with assessing land's value, the methodology for the valuation of farmland in Australia has, however, been moving towards the income-based approach. So to sum up here, financial investors approach farmland brokers with their own assumptions as to how land value should be measured and what kind of indicators they need to make land fit within their portfolios. To turn land into a financial asset, farmland brokers thus need to reimagine land's value within the value language that makes land legible for investors and commensurable with other financial assets. All right, then to come to my conclusion, I have argued today that for land to be turned into a financial asset, it needs to be reimagined in multiple ways. As mediators between the worlds of finance and farming, farmland investment brokers, as I hope to have shown, play an important role within this process. In some, rendering land investable emerges as a highly active and creative process of reimagining land and farming practices with a specific intention in mind, namely to establish land as something that is generating income streams. This process includes the active tackling of barriers, especially those related to the materiality and still biological component of land, and farming. It further involves a substantial shift in how land and farming need to be represented to financial investors to become legible and commensurable with other assets. It entails the creation and promotion and establishment of a certain, that is to say, financial value system, while disentangling and abstracting land from other value systems, such as emotional attachments or communal embedding. And assetization, finally, relies on and requires a profound redefinition of the social practices and relationships that shape how we consider land and farming and its value in societies. This then, I believe, raises important questions for land's future. So we could ask then, what does it mean for the future of land if on top of land's commodification, it now also becomes a financial asset that is supposed to deliver reliable income streams for investors. One important component, and here I just want to put these two different images or imaginations, one could say, of possible land's futures to inspire some reflection on this. But one important aspect to consider here, I think, is the very purpose of land and farming as a social practice that currently still receives a lot of its legitimacy and value from producing food for people, or even more so, not just food, but healthy, nutritious, affordable, tasty, and diversified foods. Constructing land and farming as financial assets, which deliver income streams for investors, then rests, of course, on a substantially different purpose. Within this logic, then food production gains legitimacy based on the reliability and size of the cash flow that it creates. So how would social relationships with land change if land became merely this kind of vehicle for investment, where the main goal of engaging with land is the creation of basically more money? In this scenario, it is not, I would suggest, the relationship with land or land's social and emotional capacities, its fruits and affordances, nor other more than human connections with land that count that much anymore, but rather the question whether the capital invested will increase within the respective time frame and to the expected degree. And of course, we would need to ask ourselves if this is a desirable future of land. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm now looking forward to discussing this and other questions with you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks so much for that very clear and lucid presentation. I think there's a comment in the chat which says, are these papers available online? I think they are, and I think once the recording is online, you can just find them and from the slides and download them, I suppose.
I think they should both be open access. However, if you can't find anything or you're interested in reading other things, just send me an email. I'll be happy to share whatever I've written. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, we're open for questions now. Everyone who's in the audience, you're very welcome to type your question in the chat, or if you want to kind of raise your hand and ask a question, you're also very welcome to do that, and we would actually encourage it very much because it allows us to see who's in the audience and to create a conversation, which is quite nice. So please do that. And while everybody else is gathering their thoughts, I think I'll start with a couple of questions, Sarah, if that's okay. So I suppose, one question is specifically about these reimaginings, and I was quite struck when you said, when you mentioned, the emptiness of the land, that it's at our disposal, that it needs to be used as a factory. It actually made me think a lot of kind of also colonial constructions of land in colonies, right? So at least in South Asia, we have these kind of wastelands, this discourse of the wasteland that came up, and that had to be kind of, commodified or demarcated or or things, or the factory, you know, then you think of the plantation. And I just wonder if you've thought about these parallels, if you think of this as a different packaging or something else. And then a second question is actually just about, you know, I guess about Australia, like what is making this possible in Australia? What is the specificity of its political economy context that it is so prevalent or not so prevalent? And yeah, so if you want to start with either of these or both of these, and we already have some people raising their hands, so we'll come back to that after in a minute.
Sure, yes. Thank you for these questions, Freya. Yeah, colonial constructions of land. So actually within the land rush literature, this comparison has been made a lot. So that, yeah, of course, the land rush or land grabbing has been compared with colonial land grabs. And I personally find it also quite striking what you're pointing out, like that there are similar imaginaries that are involved in potentially changing what people want to do with land, or yeah, changing these purposes or appropriating land for different purposes then, right? And I mean, I'm not sure if I would necessarily call it colonization or recolonization in the Australian context. So it's tricky. So I don't want to diminish what colonization meant also by making this kind of comparison. However, I do think that, yeah, so creating these kinds of empty imaginaries and creating these ideas of land being empty and not being used and not being used in specific ways, or they're not being people and so on. I think in both contexts, maybe the assetization that we see currently, or what these farmland companies are trying to do, and maybe also within the colonization, the process of colonization, there's a similar dimension of power, maybe, that you come in and you want to do something different. You want to, yeah, enact a certain kind of power over what should be done with this land, and how the purpose of land should be changed, or how you want to change its purpose in the future. So yeah, really nice or interesting comparison. To come to Australia. So why Australia and what makes it possible? So yeah, as I said, when I contextualize it a little bit, so it is a context that is located in the quote unquote global north, although located in the geographical south, of course. But yeah, there are certain advantages, so to say, that investors have been looking at specifically within the Australian context. So say financial, or in the US, for example, TIA, CREF, and other pension funds have already been purchasing or acquiring farmlands for quite some years. So these actors were, for example, looking for a counter-seasonal component. So they wanted to have something in the geographical north, but then also in the geographical south, but without having the risks or potential issues and problems they might have been or been thinking they could be facing in the quote unquote south, so to say. So Australia has been really mostly targeted for those reasons. So to provide a quote unquote north context, stable, assumingly stable. Actually, it also hasn't, or it didn't turn out to be that stable all the time and uncontested, but assumingly stable context. And then the other, or a really important component within that is as well, is that there's like the dimensions of Australian farms. So if you are a pension fund, for example, you are looking to acquire some farms, you are not necessarily interested in 50 or 500 or even 5,000 hectares. So you're often interested to really invest big chunks of money. And so in other contexts, say, again, quote unquote global south context, that would have often meant to accumulate a lot of or consolidate a lot of farmland before this farmland would actually be interesting, so to say, for investors. And so in the Australian context, because farms often were already very big, or had a quite a size that was to some extent already interesting for investors. Yeah, and then of course the governmental frameworks and so on. So the way how land markets work, it's relatively accessible, I would say, and the governmental structure, or more generally also Australia, considering the Australian state considering itself as being open for foreign investments, and mostly also this narrative of relying on foreign investments and so on. All these have also really facilitated for global capital investments into the Australian farm market.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions. I think Brian first. So I would ask you to please, if you can unmute yourself and also just introduce yourself and what your interest in research is, and yeah, that would be great. And then ask your question.
Thanks, Shreya. And thanks very much, Sarah. My name is Brian Garvey from University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in Scotland. I'm doing some work around land and land conflicts in Scotland, also in parts of Brazil. So it's probably just quite a basic question. I was trying to think if I could make it sound more complicated, but it's not. It's just very straightforward. I think the point 5 you had, Sarah, in terms of you're saying land, the value of land can't be measured, albeit in inverted commas, and understanding that the value of land as an asset is generated through production, in one dimension, and then through rent, whether that's now or in the future. I suppose I'm still wondering what you're saying it is about land as an asset, that cannot be measured in inverted commas, that might distinguish it from, say, any other primary commodity, for example. I'm just intrigued as to that statement. It can't be measured. So what is it about the need for work to be done to measure it as an asset that still sets it apart from another commodity, for example? Thanks.
Yeah, so when I said land value can't be measured, what did I mean? Well, I mean that value, of course, at least within my theoretical understanding, is not something that exists as such. So I don't believe that we can go somewhere and measure value, or any value, right? Not of a commodity, not of land, not of a house, not of whatever might be out there. But from my understanding, at least, I believe that value is always something that we construct, right? We socially construct value, and we have established, in some cases, really quite sophisticated ways of quote unquote measuring value, but they still remain a social practice, right? That is enacted by certain people who have certain professions, such as valuers. And there are lots of textbooks and or maybe sometimes a lot of theory also surrounding how this value can supposedly be found then, but it still remains something that we make up as human beings, right? So, and what I found then, and this is what I try to emphasize within this presentation, but also in this paper that has been published with Ethnos, I make this case in a much more comprehensive way, of course, is that the moment that here in this case land becomes financialized, there are also certain or different ways of interest being involved in how that value is constructed, or the value of land. And what I found is that for some of these investors, because value is so, like the land value appreciation is such a crucial component of the financial income stream, they of course have an interest for land's value to increase, right? And historically, the value of land in Australia, for example, what a lot of people told me, like can go up and down, or you have these circles, maybe. So it has risen continuously, but also sometimes it would have gone down and so forth. So if you look at these investors now entering this market, they don't have an interest in decreasing land values. And one of my informants actually put it quite bluntly, saying that, well, these investors come in and what they're doing, like, it's a bit of a trick, you know, they change the land valuation practice in order to have land become, or to increase in value instead of decreasing in value. I don't know if that's the case in other contexts as well, but I found it quite interesting because it's this, sometimes it's presented as this kind of black box, of course, you know, like land, there are reports about land's value and how it has developed and so on, and it's not necessarily pointed out, of course, that the way you, quote unquote, measure land as a social practice really varies significantly between different national contexts even, and also can be changed and is also being changed by depending on the actors and their interests. I hope that it's a little bit more clear. Yes, okay.
Great. So I'll just take a question from the chat and then go back to the people who've raised their hands, if that's okay, because the person might leave early. So you can read it as well if you like, Sarah. It says, of course, they enjoyed the lecture. There's a bunch of questions there. Why is land up for assetization in Australia? Is there a crisis of profitability? How tricky is it to actually assetize land? What proportion of land is being assetized? What assumptions are being made about social relations, about crop and animal market arrangements to produce the quasi-rental asset income stream in the future? How is the legal status of the land and possibly contested future changes in its legal status being valued and sold? And I guess how intermediaries themselves are competing, how they themselves inhabit a market. And so a bunch of questions there, pick and choose as you might like. And then I'll go to the other questions.
Yeah, all right. These are a lot of questions, and I'd be happy to, Barbara, if you'd like to reach out also, we can discuss this at a later point in time, maybe even personally. But yeah, so how tricky is it to try and assetize land? Well, I think it is really quite tricky, and this is why I think, this might also be the whole point of my talk. It's like, we shouldn't just take it for granted, right? So within the land rush literature or within this literature on financialization, sometimes this process has been presented as something that is just happening as some sort of force, like just coming from, I don't know where, and usually the north, of course, but yeah, and there are no difficulties. It's already done. It's already achieved. And we have to fight back and resist. And of course we do, I think. So there's no question for me anyway, personally, where I stand politically, that we do have to fight back and create resistance against these things. But we also have to understand how they actually really work, and that they are really actually quite tricky, and where the difficulties lie and so on, and also why people are doing it. And this is, I think, and just alerting us to, so what are the trickinesses and what are the tricks within that, such as changing the valuation methodology, for example, and these reimaginations. So, and I think if we understand this better and don't just consider it as a process that is big and incomprehensible, but really tricky and individual and very specific, then we can also maybe come up with better strategies for resistance. And yeah, fighting against this. What proportion of land is assetized? Well, this is, as I said, this is quite tricky to, again, quite difficult to calculate, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's so much about the proportion, because again, this comes down to numbers, right? But it's more about, like, what kind of land, right? Where is the land, for example, or which kinds of farms have been acquired by investors, and how valuable are these farms in comparison to others and so on, or what kind of crops are being targeted, and what does this mean then for the production of these crops or for the production of food, and these kinds of questions. I think these are just as important as well, even if sometimes we want to know and quantify it, but sometimes it's really quite difficult to do. And I don't know, I'll pick one more question, maybe the one about the legal status. So in terms of legality, so I think again here, I didn't see within the Australian context things like where land would have just been dispossessed or expropriated from people as we have seen it, or as many others have reported, say again for maybe sub-Saharan Africa or some parts of Asia, etc. However, at the same time, of course, we shouldn't forget about the big original land grab that Australia has already been subjected to. So again, Australia here is an interesting context in terms of its own settler colonial history and how these things are being negotiated. And intermediaries and if they consider themselves to operate in a market, for sure. And they are also competing. Yes, they are also competing. And they sometimes also don't like or appreciate each other. And that's quite interesting as well. All right, Shreya, would you like to take more questions from the people who raised their hands?
Definitely. I think if Carla, you can ask your question, and Gerardo, and then I think you can answer them together. And if you can just introduce yourself as well, Carla, and then.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. I'm from CONICET in Argentina and the University of General San Martin. I had a question regarding the operation of farming, because you mentioned basically as if the people who are buying land are themselves own operating, but were you able to identify other schemes of working land? Because in the case of Argentina, the most common, most extended example was the association with already large-scale farmers who provided a number of advantages. Among others, all the technological issues you were mentioning. And on the other hand, you mentioned among the things that had probably made a favorable context for that, for the interest of financial investors in Australia, more legal and political and economic stability, no? But what about the previous agrarian social structure? From whom did they buy the land and or rented the land? And linked to that, do you have any idea of the importance of renting land or buying land? Which is the interest of these investors? Operating in commodity production or also owning the land? Thanks.
Thanks.
Yes.
Should we also take the questions from Gerardo, or do you want to answer these first?
Either way, maybe. No, I took some notes, so it's okay. I hope to remember everything. Yeah.
Okay. Gerardo, sorry, I think I'm not saying that correctly, but do you want to unmute yourself and?
Yes, hello. I guess it's good evening for most of you. For me, it's good morning. I'm connecting from Vancouver in Canada. I'm a professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University. This was a very interesting presentation, Sarah. Thank you very much. And I can see why Carla is interested in the proportion of renting versus buying, because I mean that's the kind of work she's done in Argentina. So, I mean, I find this totally fascinating that we're in such different parts of the world. But I just wanted to briefly comment on this, the term value, because I mean, maybe we're dealing with different things here. I mean, if we were based on Marx's labor theory of value, land doesn't have value by definition, except there's a price, and the price depends on either absolute rent or differential rent. And I guess in the case of Australia, the fact that it's so close to one of the major markets in the world for food, China, maybe that is something that gives Australian land particular attractiveness in terms of price, which, I mean, is being conceptualized as value, but I would say really it may be price, I'm not sure. And I mean, I wanted to see if you thought of comparing this with something that lacks materiality completely, but there is a social construction of value in the case of crypto coin, like Bitcoin. I mean, there's nothing behind crypto currencies that's backing them, right? I mean, it's just totally speculative. But there is a large chunk of people that assign value to that in a totally socially constructed way. Because I mean, value for Marx, the way to measure value was, socially necessary labor time. Well, I don't know how much of that there is in crypto. In land, well, at least it produces stuff, right? There's all these materiality of land. So I don't know. I mean, it's just some loose ideas about whether we can really talk about socially constructed value in the case of land, or whether it's differential ground rent in this case because it's proximity in the case of Australia to China, or what are we talking about here? Values, prices, I don't know.
So lots of big questions, Sarah. It's over to you.
All right. Thank you both for these questions. Well, to start with Carla's questions. Yes, so in Australia, we can see both kinds of farmland investment models, both the way the own lease out model and the own operate model, both of which I guess are quite famous. And I should say also there are all sorts of different combinations of these models. So you often find people who, I don't know, they apply some component of this model and then with some other part of their company, they do something else, or they flexibly combine these different ways. However, more generally, I think the own operate model has been a bit more prominent in the Australian context, which is interesting in comparison to the US, where, if I understand correctly, the own lease out model is more common. I'm not sure about Argentina, but yeah, so this is mostly, I think, due to the fact that, well, the kinds of actors that have been purchasing land. So TIA, CREF, which is doing the mostly leasing model, which they do in the US. They also do that in Australia, but from what I understand, most of the other actors are more on the own operate side. Then you asked about collaboration. So yeah, that's interesting as well. So in the case, again, of TIA CREF, or in the case of the own lease out model where you have a tenant, I thought I don't know, when I started this research, I somehow assumed that they would be leasing out the land to farmers or maybe family farmers, and they also do that to some extent. However, what also I found is a quite common strategy is that they actually rent out the land to another corporate actor, like a corporate business. So not necessarily a family farmer that is the tenant, but it can be a global agribusiness company that then is the tenant. And some people even said to me, well, if you are in this business and if you then, what do you do? Of course, you want to collaborate with the best in school, so to say. So the corporate, big business, whatever agribusiness company would then be the ideal tenant as well, of course. And they themselves are also often financialized. So you have different layers of financialization happening there as well, which is quite interesting. From whom and did they buy land? So again, it's both. So there's a lot of there have been a lot of transactions that are taking place also between corporates. So you have that, but you do also have, of course, land that is being acquired from family farmers. So one company or farmland investment company I talked to, they said, well, 90% in their cases was from family farmers. But of course, they are relatively, they are smaller amounts. So if then land changes between corporates, then often it's larger amounts of land because corporates tend to have larger land ownership anyway in the beginning. Yeah, so I hope this answered most of your questions. Yeah, and just to say on that, well, as I think it's really interesting to see, as I already said, to see how these different models and ways of owning or renting or doing different things with land managing, also how they are being combined, you know, that it's not as always like separated as in a textbook, but yeah, people just creatively do whatever makes sense to them, I think. Yeah, coming to Joe's question or comment maybe surrounding value. Yeah, this is, of course, a bit, could be a bit of a provocative stance I'm taking here on value, how I consider value. And of course, we could question as to whether maybe some things have a bit more value even without social construction, such as land. I don't know. But yeah, definitely within the social construction of land, or within my conceptual understanding here, the proximity to China plays a very big role. This is, yeah, one of the major factors, one could say, why lots of investors actually have been interested in the Australian context, because it has this proximity to the Asian markets, and then of course China is the biggest player within that. But apart from that, I think it's interesting to once again look at land and how its value, even like how it comes into existence in comparison maybe to other things that we might be valuing. And this is exactly what some of my interviewees or land valuers that I talked to, what they said to me is that, well, this way of valuing an asset in regard to its future productive capacity, or what it's going to maybe produce in the future, as this is mostly used within financial, or to value financial assets or other financial assets. Some of them, they were actually quite profoundly against approaching land in this kind of way, and said, well, it doesn't really make too much sense if you try and do this with land, because you can't really calculate this kind of future for land, because it's so, or for land's production, it is so unpredictable, or you have to calculate, you have to take into account so many different factors that in the end it is more or less an arbitrary number that you come up with. So if you compare it, I don't know, with a shopping center, you say maybe, okay, we have X amounts of people that will come into this shopping center every year, every week, or whenever, and this is how the value of this shopping center maybe is calculated, the future value, the income is calculated. And apparently, from what my interviewees at least said, it's way more complex to try and do this for land or for farming, So to the extent that, yeah, it's arbitrary. Yeah, while at the same time, of course, maybe a shopping center, if, I don't know, if there's no shop at all, that or all the shops close down, or it's COVID, I don't know, then its value completely disappears, where maybe with land, that's the question, can its value disappear completely? Maybe if it's deteriorated to the extent, or maybe if you have some mining going on, then you can completely destroy the land to the extent that maybe you could actually, in no possible future, produce anything on this land anymore. But yeah, I don't know. So I don't know if this reacts or responds to any of your, in some way to your comment, but I think for me anyway, it's, yeah, I thought it was a fascinating thing to see in terms of what people have been doing. And yeah, to somehow look behind this this number of the land's value that is often presented as if it just was a given and not something that you actually have to bring into being.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. So there's, by the way, for people who are on the chat, if you still have a question, this is your chance to ask it. We'll just take one question which was on the chat a bit earlier, which was from Bhupendra, who was asking if the cultural meaning associated with the land kind of locally is changing because of this assetization, and how does that then change the value of the land? And I guess if you can, I think you had mentioned something about the tenant culture, but yeah, if you could say more about that, and if in the meantime anyone has a final comment or question, please raise your hand or put it there.
Yes, yeah. So this is exactly what I try to say with the social norms and values, of course. Yes. So if land becomes this kind of financial asset, its cultural meaning changes tremendously, and it might of course be very contradictory to a lot of other cultural and social meanings that are associated with land, or historically have been associated with land. So if we just again think of Australia as also a settler colony, where of course there are also all these indigenous association or cultural meanings attributed to land, which of course are in many ways highly conflictuous with treating land as even not only as a commodity. I mean, also that is, I guess, a conflict there, but then also as an asset. So all these cultural meanings associated with land, I think they have to be changed actively, but they're also subconsciously, maybe, I guess, as these processes continue and further advance, they also are changing subconsciously within that. And yeah, so this ownership component that I try to emphasize here is one component, or one important aspect within that. So why would you need to own your land to be a farmer? It's an interesting question. And how does that change the value? Yeah, I guess it also changes again. So how do we as people, as society, how do we value land? What does it mean? And if you don't have to own it anymore, like or like if you're just a land manager, how does that also affect your identity? How do you relate to that land? Do you treat it differently? Do you think of future generations? Like, do you want to pass it on to someone or not? If you're not owning it, of course, that is different. But then, of course, yeah, we can also question, of course, the ownership conceptualization. And is it really important to own land, or couldn't we imagine or reimagine land beyond property regimes and so on? So anyway, this is for another discussion, I guess, as well. But yeah, I hope I could comment a little bit on this question as well. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I think I think we have no more questions or comments. Thanks so much for sharing your work with us today, Sarah. And I mean, I can see from the comments, like people really, really appreciated it. And thank you also for your very kind of thorough responses. To everyone else in the audience who's still here, thanks for joining us. And the only thing that's left to say is that our next seminar is on Thursday, 8th of February. It's by Jorg Novak from University of Brasilia, who will be talking about global labor studies, racial capitalism, and the Plantationocene, analyzing capitalism as an integral formation. So thanks, everyone. And thanks, Sarah. Have a good night. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you very much as well. Bye-bye.
Bye.